I was thinking about sharing books in prison, borrowing them, lending them. You see, I'm rereading some of the letters that I wrote home to my wife while I was incarcerated, and in one of them I noted that I was overjoyed to be reading a good book, a decent book, I called it. I had borrowed Shogun by James Clavell from my downstairs neighbor, John. This is whenever I was housed with Blinky, and I'd been complaining that there were no good books to read. I must have been exaggerating the case, at least slightly, because in the next letter I mentioned that I'm reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This is around the time that the movies came out, so I'm not surprised there were a couple of copies floating around, but still a great set of books to read, and I was grateful for the opportunity. At most institutions, most buildings, most yards, whenever you get there, if you ask, there's an unofficial lending library. You can say, hey, I like to read Westerns, and somebody will say, oh, well, Jimmy over in such and such, he has Westerns. In some institutions, there's actually an official lending library, meaning that there is a cart out in the day room where people are allowed to leave books or to take books if they want them. This is because everyone reads in prison. Even inmates who don't read, they're not readers, they still read a little. They probably even have a book or two in their property. I'm going to tell a story about a cellie that I had named Jimmy. And I had in my head classified him as illiterate. I don't mean that in any kind of judgmental way. I mean that he was obviously severely ADHD. In addition to that, he'd casually mentioned that he had dyslexia and had difficulty making the words stay still on the page. One day, whenever I was on the upper rack, I leaned over and looked down, and Jimmy was reading a book, The Haunted Mesa by Louis L'Amour, one of Louis L'Amour's better works, in my opinion. I didn't want to bother Jimmy, so I just went back to doing my homework, but I noted that he was reading a book, and just a couple of days prior, he had asked me to look at a letter that his mother had written him and explain what some of the words meant and what she was trying to say. The Haunted Mesa was a pretty advanced piece of literature for Jimmy, and I was impressed, so I waited until I saw him put it down, and it was a long time, over a half hour. Jimmy had severe ADHD. I don't know that I saw him do anything for over a half hour. Whenever he was done, I leaned over and asked him, hey man, I don't mean anything by this, but I'm surprised you're reading that book. That's a hard book to read. Good for you. He didn't take it personally. We were friends, and it was understandable that I would have commented on it. Later, things did get pretty difficult between him and I. I mentioned that he had mental illness problems, and there was a point at which I legitimately thought he was going to kill me. But this was before Cellicide was a concern, and he and I were on great terms, so he was happy to explain to me that this was his favorite book. Whenever he'd been in the SHU on an assault 2 years prior, his friend had shot him the book and said, hey, you need something to read? Here, read this. And Jimmy hadn't wanted to read it, but he'd left it in the cell anyway, just to be polite. Back there in the SHU, there's nothing else. You don't have a TV, or at least you didn't then, and you can only do so many burpees in a day. You can only just lie there for so long. So after long enough, he picked up the book and tried to read it. As he explained it, it was impossible. He couldn't read it, and he got frustrated and put it down. But you're just there, in a cell, empty cell. No TV, no other books, so he picked it back up and tried again. It took him 2 months to read that book. He's told me he put it down and picked it back up a dozen times. This had been 2 years prior. He had been back then in the SHU for having committed an assault, and he was back in the PHU with me, again after having committed an assault. Dang it. It took him 2 months to read that book. As he explained it to me, he put it down and picked it back up a dozen times. This had been 2 years prior to my meeting him whenever he was back in the SHU on an assault. Whenever he was my cellie, we were in the PHU after he had again committed an assault. As he explained it to me, that book he had read at least 5 times, maybe more, in the 2 years since. That he just picked it up and read a couple of pages whenever he felt like it, and that it was a relaxing experience for him. Back in the shoe, it can be very difficult to get books sent back and forth. He explained that he'd had his friend down the tier send him a book. This is not a casual thing down in the shoe. It took him 2 months to read that book. As he explained it, he'd put it down and picked it back up a dozen times, but there was just nothing else to do, so he just kept reading it until he was done. But then once he was done with it, there was still nothing to do. So he read it a second time. This had been 2 years prior to my meeting him, and he told me he'd read the book at least 10 times in that 2-year period. That occasionally he'd just feel the urge and he'd pick it up and read through something that he'd read before, and he knew what it was going to say, but that it was relaxing for him to read the book. I thought of it as a meditative practice, though I'm not sure he would have expressed it as such. He said that he'd gotten this book from his friend whenever he was back in the shoe, as if that was a casual thing, but having books passed back in the shoe or the hole is actually a difficult process. You have to understand that the cell doors are all the way up to where they meet with the concrete, and then they go all the way down until there is just a very small lip between the bottom of the door and the concrete floor. I've seen cells that were so close to the ground that you couldn't slide a mustard packet down under the door. This can be difficult because if you want to get a book from somebody, you're going to have to fish, meaning that you're going to have to take something like a mustard packet or perhaps the end of an envelope that you've filled with powdered soap and a little bit of water and tamped down a little bit, and then you slide it under your door. You have attached to it some string that you've made, perhaps out of torn up sheets or torn up clothes, and you get some momentum. You create centripetal force by spinning the string like this, and then you, like that, using your forearm to get as much oomph out as you can, and it can fly a good ways, even if you had very little space in which to work. You have string attached to this, and you holler down to your friend, "Hey Frank, do you see my line? I need a book." Ideally, Frank is only a couple cells down, so he's able to get you your book. But if Frank happens to be on the other side of the tier, for instance, well, you're not going to be able to fish to Frank. You're going to have to fish to Bob, who will fish to Paco, who will fish to Johnny, and then he'll fish to Frank. Of course, this means that you're occasionally going to be asked to help Frank, Bob, or Paco fish to their respective people on the other side of the tier too, and it's just something people do back in the hole. "Hey, such and such, do you see my line? Can you pass me over to such and such?" And then they'll get their mustard packet or their little envelope and fish it out on the tier and pull the person in. If you're lucky and you have a particularly high door, you can actually build a ramp out of toilet paper and soap, maybe a little bit of salt and some water, and you press it and dry it. And you force this thing out your door like this, like a turn, and you keep the lip of the ramp inside of your door so that you can throw something at the ramp good and hard, like a bar of soap if it'll fit under the door, or again that mustard pack, and it'll thump up into the air and fly over the railing on the second tier, or if you're on the third tier, fourth tier, fifth tier, up over the railing and down. And then somebody who is on that tier is able to toss something out, and you create a swing effect by pulling your line back and forth until they're able to catch it and bring it onto their tier. Doing this, you can actually have people fishing all the way from one end of the building on the first tier, all the way up and across to the fifth tier with torn up sheets or whatnot, sending stuff back and forth. Not often a book, generally something else, kites or contraband perhaps, but yes, books or food or whatever inmates happen to be passing back and forth. I'm told there are some pens where in the summer it gets so hot, inmates just break the windows out of their cells as a matter of course. Once they've done this, they're actually able to fish with other buildings by throwing something out their window, and then the guy in the other building tosses something out of their window, and they meet up and pull it in. I don't know that it's ever happened, but I suppose it's theoretically possible that people have fished clear across a yard over the course of an afternoon, just saying, hey, Frank, toss me to Bob, toss me to Jim, toss me to Bob. Of course, just getting something from somebody doesn't mean it can come into your cell. You could always tell a book that had been in the shoe and been passed around like this because it was very carefully chopped up into 10-page segments. You see, you can't just pull a book in. You could barely fit a mustard packet out. So what they have to do is tie each 10-page segment individually in the line very carefully. And you pull it in just so that it doesn't get caught, and then you work on the next 10-page segment. It can be a trial. The worst experience I had with this was whenever I was in the hole one time, and my neighbor had the entire Green Mile. But he didn't have the single book, he had the 6-book set that had come out as a serial. All divvied up into 10-page chunks and mixed together. Boy, I was happy to get all of those 10-page chunks, but it felt like a lot of work to get it worked out into one cohesive story instead of just random chunks of pages. Worse yet would have been if a chunk was missing, as commonly happened. I was offered, and I'm sad to say read, on many occasions 2/3 of this book or half of that book, just because the other part had gotten lost along the way. Maybe 2 people were reading the book at the same time, and then one of them paroled or passed it along to somebody else, and so now the halves are separated. I said that books are important to inmates like they're not important to everybody. And it's a funny thing because fiction, this experience of reading a story that somebody else wrote and allowing it to dim the reality on your everyday experiences, and you step into their world, even that tiny fraction of you enters their world. Oh, it's wonderful, and especially in prison. I cannot describe how mundane and dreary this environment can be. The walls are gray, the metal is all unpolished steel. They frost the window on your cell so that you can't see out, and so the sunlight that comes in is diffused and inorganic. The idea that you can just kind of lie back and read a book and suddenly be somewhere else, even just a little bit, I understand why Jimmy put so much work into being able to read that book. I put the same amount of work into reading, and maybe I read more, but so what? I had somebody tell me I shouldn't tell this story, that it's mean. It sounds like I'm making fun of somebody with a learning disability. On another occasion, whenever I told this story, I had a friend tell me it was very sad that Jimmy wanted to be able to read and couldn't. I must just be seeing this different than they are, because it's a story of conquest to me. This is a story where Jimmy won. He didn't read that book, he conquered it over the course of months and years. Look, I read fast. I read a book a day sometimes. I love to read. My dad, he reads slower. I'll watch him read a book for a week or 2. I know he loves to read. Jimmy, he read really slow. It took him 2 years to read a book. And I think he loved to read. So what if it's more or less? The point is he spent 2 years reading, and I don't think he got anything less out of what he read than out of what I read or my dad got out of what he read. Books are intrinsic to who we are in some ways. We all have a favorite book. I'm not going to ask you to go and read your favorite book. We're all really busy. But take the moment and think of it. Heck, it doesn't have to be a book. Call it a work of art. It can be a film or a painting, but hold it in your head for that second. You can think of the cover or a scene that was particularly poignant to you, just how you felt the last time that you experienced it. And that's all you have to do, because it's the magical thing about the way our brains are wired. If you just think about it, hold it in your head for a couple of minutes, you experience it all over again. I don't doubt for a moment that's what Jimmy was doing whenever he was reading and rereading The Haunted Mesa. It's what I was doing too. Thank you for listening today.